welcome back to my channel. This is going to be the October wrap-up for all of the books that I read. If you've been following me on Instagram, then you already know most of these. If not, I'll link my Instagram down in the description below. That way you can keep up with all of my ratings for November, which the video for my TBR for November will be up tomorrow. So, yay! My initial TBR for October was like this big, and then it dwindled down to maybe about this big, maybe. Okay, so for starters, I'm wearing my Halloween costume. Can you guess who I am? No? You can't guess it from this? No, okay, hold on. What about now? Can you guess? Oh, come on. You should know from this. Okay. Alright, now I'm feed spooning it to you here. Do you know who I am for Halloween? Well, do you know now? Yeah, you know now. Yay! Alright, let's crack into this. So first we have my middle grade series that I did this month. I had initially planned to read 10 Scooby-Doos, 10 Mary-Kate and Ashley mysteries, and 10 Goosebumps. I cut a lot of things out, and one of the things that I cut out was these middle grade series. The first 10 that I read were all Scooby-Doos. Love me some Scooby-Doos. They uploaded the Zombie Island movie to Netflix, I think, and so I watched it, and then I went on a little bit of a binge. I have a couple other ones, but these were the ones I wanted to read. I've rated the Scooby-Doo books. I'll give you my scores, but I'm really not going to go into detail. They're regular Scooby-Doo mysteries. You know what's good, what's not. I read The Carnival Creeper, which I gave 4 stars. I read The Sunken Ship, which I gave 3 stars. I read The Ghostly Gorilla, which I gave 4 stars. I read Toy Story Terror, which I also gave 4 stars. I gave the Fairground Phantom 4 stars. I gave The Rowdy Rodeo 2 stars. I gave Cyberchase 3 stars, and The Monster in Mexico 4 stars. And the last two I had was Aliens 2, which is pretty much Alien Invaders, which I gave 3 stars, and then the Eerie Ice Monster, which I gave 3 stars. Now with all of the Scooby-Doos, they're middle grade. I don't want to judge them too harshly because I do love Scooby-Doo. The thing about Scooby-Doos is that they do become formulaic. Luckily, the way that I read some of these, they had an ebb and flow to them. Some of them were better than the others. I will say that with any of you who are thinking that I rated Cyberchase way too low is because the film is better than its adaptation of the book. The Cyberchase movie that came out in 2001 is better than the book. That's just my opinion. And I feel like this was one of the first ones that was adapted because The Monster in Mexico, the movie, is not good. I watched it so you didn't have to. Don't watch it. There's a reason why millennials stop at Cyberchase. Millennials watch Zombie Island, The Witch's Ghost, Alien Invaders, and Cyberchase for a reason. Don't bore yourself with this movie. Read the book instead. The book is a lot better. It's more in more detail. The adaptation is really bad. Next, I read 2 Mary-Kate and Ashley books. The first was The Missing Mummy, which I gave 4 stars. It isn't one of my favorites because I didn't get to those because I actually cut these off at 2. The reason why I cut these off at 2 is because I read The Green Ghost, which I gave 2 stars. I had already figured out what was going on before halfway into the book. I actually DNF'd it and didn't finish. What I did was I skipped all the way to the end to find out if that's who it was, and it really made me mad, and so I stopped reading these books before the rest of them made me mad and I was wasting my time. Which is probably why I didn't read any Goosebump books, which is sad. I probably should, but I didn't, and so I digress. Next, we're going to get into the novels that I read this year. The first one I want to talk about is The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and The Body Snatcher in a graphic novel form. Oh my god, was this amazing. It's absolutely gorgeous. Absolutely beautiful. I posted this one on my Instagram. It's just so great. Scientist named Dr. Jekyll. He takes this potion that he's created to try and see the other side of himself, which is Mr. Hyde. Mr. Hyde is a very, very bad person. I mean, he murders people. Spoiler alert, if you didn't know that, he murders people. And Dr. Jekyll keeps doing this for the advance of science until one day it goes horribly, horribly, horribly wrong because he just transforms into Mr. Hyde and he cannot get the antidote to try to change back. And it's just, it's a grand old time. It's a great, great classic story for the month of October. And then at the back of it is the Body Snatcher. Oh, it's just a little short story, but it is so good. It is so good. It is absolutely one of my favorites. I gave Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde 4 stars, and I gave the Body Snatcher 5 stars. You would think that it would be the other way around, and it probably should, granted if you read it in its normal novelization, but the normal novelization of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, I kind of, as much as I loved the graphic novel, I kind of like the novelization of the book better, which is why I gave it 4 stars. But the Body Snatcher, it is amazing. It really, really benefits from the pictures, and the graphic novels is so good. I gave it 5 stars. And another reason as to why I gave it 5 stars is because the story of the Body Snatcher is based on a real story. It's a story about people bringing corpses to the scientists to be able to dissect them and find out what, you know, to deal with cadavers and basically go into morticianing. But the catch is first the people who were bringing the bodies, they were bringing up corpses that were already dead. And then they start to murder people and bring them in for money, because if you brought a corpse in, the university gave you money, that way you were participating in science. And they actually start going out and murdering people. And this is based on a true story. This is based on a real case in Edinburgh. The surgeon is Robert Knox, and the notorious Burke Hare murders of 1828. The real life story, not in the Victorian era, it's actually in the Georgian era, but the short story was written in the Victorian era, which went hand in hand with Penny Dreadfuls and everything else that was Gothic. Penny Dreadfuls, Sweeney Todd, anything like that. It was great. So 4 stars for Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and 5 stars for the Body Snatcher. I need to weigh in here. The Body Snatcher, though those things happen, though it's based on the case from Edinburgh, they did happen all over Britain. And my alma mater, King's College London, in the heart of London, also accepted bodies that were being murdered. So you think you know a university, but I will say that I did know that information about the university before I went.
The second time.
I didn't know when I went to study abroad, but I knew before I did my master's. And I don't know. It's just a Victorian charm there. And the next one is kind of part of a series, but then it's also not. But that is The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, and The Silmarillion. And so The Hobbit I gave 4.5 stars. I usually don't give half stars, but I just didn't feel that it was... I felt that it was higher than 4 but lower than 5. I read The Hobbit after I've seen the films. I already knew from the films that about half of it was not in the book, and it's the half that I'm okay with that's not in the book. The book is pretty straightforward. It's a pretty basic adventure tale. What I really, really loved about this, because I started this at the beginning of October and I was reading it along with Lord of the Rings, and it just felt like a little bit of a break, because Lord of the Rings, I say it's dense, is not as dense as the Silmarillion, but so this is more of a lighthearted note as compared to Lord of the Rings. I don't want to talk too terribly much about the films. I want to talk more about the book. So the book, it is a little episodic. For me, that's fine. You know, one chapter is like, here's what happens. They defeat it, they move on. You know, they have little challenges along the way. So it's a company of 13 dwarves, 1 hobbit, or the burglar, as you call him, as you do, and Gandalf. The thing about Gandalf is that he's only in the book for about half of it, about the beginning and then the end. The whole middle chunk of the book, he's not there for. He's off doing other wizard stuff, which has to come into play into Lord of the Rings. We follow Bilbo and his relationships with the dwarves, him getting outside and leaving the Shire and having a new adventure and a new experience. I would want to say that it's kind of like when you leave home for the first time and you go off. See, I went to Kentucky for college. I went three states away, and then I went and studied abroad in Britain. So it's like every time you move, you're leaving your comfort zone. That's what this tale is. It's about you leaving your comfort zone, getting into adventure, and finding all the fun within. The one thing there's two things I really loved about this book, is that it honestly feels like you are reading it from the perspective of Bilbo Baggins as he's retelling you the story, because he'll abruptly go in and stop and be like, so here's the story, da 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 da. I don't have time to tell you about this part right here, so we're just gonna skip it and don't worry about it. You'll figure it out later. And you're like, okay, which is true. You do find out about it, especially when the stuff with Gandalf you find out about that in Lord of the Rings. But it's just like, I don't have time to tell you right now, so we're just gonna skip that. And then you have the chapter where you have a specific chapter with the dragon, and it's one of the only chapters that are not from Bilbo's perspective, and so it's like the author is having to write it secondhand. So I really enjoyed that it sounded like Bilbo was writing this and you were reading it as Bilbo was retelling it after the fact. So, and the next thing that I absolutely loved about this is the riddle chapter. It's only the 5th chapter, and it's the only chapter that has to deal with Bilbo and Gollum, and they're going back and forth, and they're reading riddles to each other, and honestly, the dynamic between them, mwah, it is the best chapter out of the whole book. It's a shame that it's at the beginning, but it's a really good chapter. So, The Hobbit, 4.5 out of 5 stars. Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings, where to start? I decided to take this book slowly throughout the month, so I only read about 2 chapters a day. Lord of the Rings is intended to be one book, but it was published in 3 volumes, which is, as we know it, as Fellowship of the Ring, Two Towers, and Return of the King. So for Fellowship of the Ring, I gave 4 stars. For Two Towers, I gave 4.5 stars, and then for Return of the King, I gave 4.75 stars. I honestly think I have been ruined by the films for these, but I can enjoy the book for what it is. There are some things that I absolutely love. I'm gonna put this down, it's heavy. I like the friendship between Gimli and Legolas more in this book. But then I like the character struggle of Aragorn better in the films. I don't like that he's gung-ho and all this. Like I said, the films have probably ruined me for this book. I can appreciate it and enjoy it for what it is, but I also love the films so much.
There's gonna be another video about Lord of the Rings coming up soon, so look for that next week.
Yeah, overall, on average, it gets a 4.4 out of stars, which is pretty good for a high fantasy. I'm not really the biggest fantasy reader. Obviously, I've read Harry Potter, and I've read a couple other things, but most of those were YA. When it comes to adult fantasy, especially particularly high fantasy, I'm not the biggest fan, just because it's a lot. I mean, even Game of Thrones, I can get into it because it's visually pleasing, but it's just sitting down and reading it can be a bit much, and so I'm usually not a fantasy reader, probably because of that reason. I like to be able to visually see it a lot better. So the fact that I got through this hunk of sucker and really enjoyed it, I really, really enjoyed this a lot more than I thought I could. I think this was the second time I tried to pick it up, and one of the other things that I really enjoyed was the point of view characters, because for the entire first volume, everything is from Frodo's perspective. The whole company is together in the first book, and in the second book, everyone starts to divide up and they divide into 2 groups and go off in 2 different directions.
Oh no, 3! They go off in 3 directions!
Because in the Two Towers, you have Aragorn's perspective, Pippin's perspective, and Frodo's perspective. So they kind of break it up into 3, and then by the time you get to Return of the King, they break it up into like 7 different perspectives, and you only know by the beginning of the chapter, but wow, yes. For this 4.4 altogether, that's all 3. the 4 stars, the 4.5 stars, the 4.75 stars, all leads to a 4.4 out of 5 for Lord of the Rings, which it was amazing. It was great. The book is absolutely fantastic. It's a joy, and I'm glad that I read it. It's probably something that I may return to, not anytime soon, but I can at least say that I have officially read the book and not just seen the films, and I'm proud of that. So the last book from the Tolkien world is the Silmarillion. The Silmarillion.
Wow, what to say about the Silmarillion?
I may have said that Lord of the Rings was dense compared to The Hobbit. I don't even have a word to tell you what this is. This is, whew, buddy, was it a struggle to get through. It has some great stories in it, because this tells the story of the creation of the world, and all of it's like Eru Iluvata is basically God. He creates the earth, and then he creates the Valar and the Maya, or the Maiar. I don't know. Maiar is one of the two. They and they're pretty much like angels, which is what Gandalf is, and then Sauron is also one of the Maya, but you know, he's evil, but they're basically the same species. I think Gandalf, from what I understand, I think Gandalf is supposed to be like the polar opposite of Sauron, which makes sense. But I think it makes sense anyway. It made sense when I read it. But God creates the angels through the music, and it's his thought, and it's weird. But it goes on, he creates the earth, and then he creates the children. His children first are elves and then are men. And then his children of thought, one of them, there's 14 of the Valar and the Maya, and then there's Melkor. Melkor was his first. I'm pretty sure Melkor is supposed to be like Lucifer, the archangel Lucifer, because he breaks off and he becomes evil. That's the only way that I could describe it. But Melkor is kind of, he's kind of like Lucifer. He goes off and he creates the orcs. He's the reason for the orcs that, like, it also goes through and it tells you how the dwarves are created and the Ents, which is awesome. The Ents are great. Can't talk about the Ents enough.
Which goes to show that I didn't talk about the Ents in Lord of the Rings.
I forgot to tell you that the Ents in this book are so great. They are so good. You find out that the elves woke them up and taught them to speak and all this stuff, and how they've lost, they go into detail about how they've lost their wives, and the answer is they just lost them. Back to the Ents. The Ents, learning how the Ents were made was really, like, I was just reading along and I got to Yavanna and she started talking about trees, and I was like, did she make the Ents?
Did she make the Ents?
The Ents! Oh, the creation of the Ents. So it goes through the creation of the dwarves and the Ents, and then after all of the creation and stuff, which is in the first age, it goes into the story of the Silmarils, which are these 3 gems, and the back and forth conquest of trying to take the gems. They were created by Feanor, or he found them. I don't remember.
I said it was dense.
And Melkor steals them, and then they try to get them back, and then it's a bunch of wars. That's just one of the stories. It goes through all of the stories. It's literally, it's a theological history book, which is what it is. And it goes through all of this stuff, and then you've got the Silmarils and all the wars, and then it gets to Beren and Luthien. And Beren is a man, and he falls in love with an elf, and then this is kind of the penultimate story of Aragorn and Arwen in Lord of the Rings. And then, so it all ends up with the ending of the first age, and then it goes into snippets of a little bit of the second age and the rise of Sauron and how he came to power, and then it talks a little bit about the third age, and then that's the Silmarillion. I gave it 4 stars, mainly because it is really good. I just gave it 4 stars because it's really hard for me to get into. And like I said, it's dense. It's, boy, oh boy, is it dense. Whew. Greek mythology meets the Bible. That is what this is. That's the only thing I can say. Yeah. So, 4 stars. The last novel I read this month is my book from Book of the Month, which was The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. Whew, so much emotion. This follows the story of a young girl who's supposed to be married, but she doesn't want to, and so she runs away, and then in the forest she prays to the gods, but she prays to the gods at night because the sun's already gone down, and you're not supposed to pray to the gods at night. And pretty much she prays to the gods at night, and she sells her soul basically for immortality. She wants to be able to live her life, and she tells the god, demon, whatever you want to call him, that he can have her when she's done with her life. And so he makes her forever immortal as a 23-year-old. But the backlash to her curse is that no one remembers her. So it's kind of like whenever she can talk to you and they know that they're talking to her, but as soon as a door shuts or they turn away or anything like that, they have absolutely no idea who she is. And so this book explores and it goes through it. The main storyline is in 2014, so it takes place in the modern day, and then it jumps back and forth between 1914 and then 1714, and then the 1714 timeline progresses until the climax where they intersect and they meet. And so in the modern timeline of 2014, she meets someone who remembers her, and she's completely baffled and confused because no one is supposed to be able to remember her. She's lived 300 years and she knows that no one could remember her, and then someone does. And so she's really confused and she wants to find out more, and so she goes digging and she finds out why. So she builds a relationship with the god of the night and this boy named Henry, and he's the one who remembers her, and she builds a relationship with both of them, and the relationship between both of them is really interesting and really dynamic. I absolutely love it. It keeps you're pulled back and forth, and it's a range of emotion. Now, what's interesting is that Luke, the god, Luke, however you want to pronounce it, I figured it was it's L-U-C, Luce, I don't know. I figured it was the French version of the word Luke, or the name Luke, so I went with it. He embodies her entire fantasy. So she fantasizes about her dream man back in 1714, and so Luke is like the embodiment of her fantasy. That is what she sees. Her fantasy comes to her every year because he visits her every year to ask if she's ready to give up her life, and she always says no, and they go back and forth, and so she has to see her fantasy every year. And it's interesting because when she finds Henry kind of resembles Luke. He kind of resembles her fantasy. And one of the really interesting parts that I absolutely loved about this is that Addie is in love with her fantasy. And she's got what I'll say is that Addie is in love with her fantasy, and she can have her fun and she can play around with it, but at the end of the day, she has to know that it doesn't control her. They are not one and the same. She has to let go of her fantasy. She has to break from it. Will she break from it? That's a good question, because the ending of this book is kind of open to interpretation. So it ends the way that it may be a sequel, it may not be, but who knows? I'll have to wait and find out to see if V.E. Schwab makes another book of these. But great. 5 stars. Absolutely loved it. It was wonderful. If you haven't read it yet, go and read this one. It's very good, modern fantasy, very great. This whole book is an aesthetic. It's just, it's a kind of a dark academia aesthetic. It's like literature and travel and history and it's just all sorts of things. It's an aesthetic. I love it. Read this book. The last thing in October that I read would be my short story collections. I had a lot more of these lined up than I actually read. So I didn't get to read much of my Sherlock Holmes, but I did read one Sherlock, which was nice. And the first collection of short stories came from London After Midnight. London After Midnight is a collection of short stories that tells pretty much horrific stories about London at night. That's all I can really say. A lot of thriller, murder, all sorts of stuff, because London is an insane and crazy place. I didn't read all of them in here. I chose 4 to read. I read the Adventure of the Worst Man in London, which is a Sherlock Holmes story, which I gave 5 stars. I gave 5 stars. It was absolutely fantastic. It's a Sherlock Holmes short story that is not like his other Sherlock. I don't know. It's different. It's interesting and it's different. I really enjoyed it. It's more of a comedic piece. It's different than the other Sherlock Holmes stories that everyone knows. Then I read Yellow Iris by Agatha Christie, which is a Poirot story. It's really short. It's cool to see Christie write Poirot very quick-witted and fast, and all of the deductioning is really fast and exemplary in it. It was great. I gave it 4 stars. Then I read The Flight from Fleet Street, which is a Sweeney Todd. It's a writing about Sweeney Todd. It really wasn't the best. It was okay. I gave it 3 stars. It's not that bad, but it's not that great either. It follows this dumb, literally really dumb American man. Ignorant, I guess I should say. He goes to London for the first time, and that's fine. He finds out that this murderer who's on the loose who looks exactly like him, and then he goes and he decides to find the man who looks just like him and turn him in, and it's really dumb. And then they get swept up in Sweeney Todd, and the only reason why Sweeney gets caught is because the American guy's wife, who's a Brit, sees all of it through a window. It's just, I don't like it. It's not for me. It's just not my fave. And the last one what I read was People Don't Do Such Things. 2 stars. Absolutely just, I want to say I hated it, but if I hated it, I would have given it 1 star. It was just, it's just, man meets woman, they get married, then their marriage is boring, and then she cheats on him with his best friend, and then murder, and she ends up dead, or he ends up dead. Honestly, I don't even remember because I didn't even care. So, yeah, People Don't Do Such Things. Don't read that one. Then I read some of the collections out of my Edgar Allan Poe book. I read The Raven, The Black Cat, The Murders at Rue Morgue, and The Telltale Heart. All of those are 5 stars. They're my absolute favorites. I love them. Then I read Shadow, A Parable, and Silence, A Fable. I gave them both 4 stars. They were a little weird, but I gave them 4 stars. And then I read The Fall of the House of Usher, which I gave 3 stars. I don't know if I want to explain them. Most of the Poe stories that anyone has ever heard of, we all had to read it in school. So I don't want to talk too much about them because I don't really want to give it away. Poe is he's just Poe, and they're great. A Telltale Heart is my absolute favorite. Just the heartbeat under the bed is just, Yeah, October was a pretty fun month. It was a very, very large challenge, and I dare say that November is not going to be small by any means. It's also a large challenge, but who knows? We'll see how it goes. October spooky season read done for 2020. Bring on 2021. Bye-bye!